Welcome to the Jesus Talks as we continue to study the life of Jesus, and now we begin to look at his team in the 13th study. We've spent quite a lot of time getting all the background to the biography of Jesus of Nazareth, but from this study on we'll allow ourselves to fix more upon the immediate circle of Jesus much more. We're beginning to look at what he did and said, and from the days when he began to gather these followers around him right through to the moment when he ascends to the cosmic throne room of heaven after he'd passed through death into this immortal kind of human life at the centre of all reality. Well, Jesus clearly began to gather followers from the earliest days of his activity. In John's biography, some of the key apprentices joined Jesus before he had done any of his famous miracles. Some of them had been following John the Baptist and began to follow Jesus after John identified Jesus as the promised Messiah. Others drew their own conclusions after talking to Jesus. In the very early days of Jesus' work, in John's Gospel, chapter 2 from verse 1, we're told, on the third day a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Luke indicates in Luke chapter 6 and verse 12 that although Jesus gathered general followers around him, yet there came a time when he chose just 12 of them to be his close apprentices. So who did he choose, and what do we know about them? So let's listen in. Luke chapter 6 from verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James son of Alphaeus, Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Each of the biographies of Jesus tells us something of this process of selecting the 12. It's in Matthew 10 from verse 1, Mark 3 from verse 13, this Luke 6 from 12, and John chapter 1 from verse 35. We begin with Simon and Andrew, who were brothers. Jesus gave Simon a new name, Peter, so we often find him referred to as Simon Peter. Andrew had initially been a follower of John the Baptist. Let's hear John's record of how Andrew and Simon began to follow Jesus from John chapter 1 from verse 35. The next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you'll see." So they went and saw where he was staying and spent that day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what John had said and followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We found the Messiah, that is the Christ." And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. The next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. So these first three of Jesus' apprentices were from Bethsaida, a town not far from Capernaum at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. James and John were from the same area too, and Jesus called them to follow him when they were fixing the fishing nets of their father Zebedee. They had the nickname Sons of Thunder due to their impulsive, passionate and emotional reactions. Well, they dropped their nets, forgot their career in the fishing industry, and joined this strange, mixed and homeless group gathering around Jesus. Nathanael was another early follower of Jesus. He was from Cana, a town near to Nazareth, but also in the Galilee area. He's also known as Bartholomew, and Jesus refers to him as a true Israelite. Two disciples are called Jude or Judas, though the first one is also known as Thaddeus, the son of a man called James. Although he's not mentioned very much in the New Testament writings, he's very highly regarded in the lands to the north and northeast of Palestine, because that's where he's said to have gone in later years, possibly with Bartholomew. There are some amazing stories about the later missionary adventures of Thaddeus in Turkey and Syria, but we must leave them for another course of study. The final five of Jesus' apprentices are slightly more controversial and complicated. Thomas is well known as the disciple who refused to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead until he had personally and physically inspected Jesus' wounds for himself. He's also called Didymus, the twin. People have speculated why he was called this. He may simply have had a twin brother. Or another popular idea is that he looked so like Jesus himself that they called him the twin. Some have even thought that he may have been some kind of relative of Jesus, though for obvious reasons he cannot have been the twin brother of Jesus himself. Two of the remaining apprentices, Matthew and James, are both described as sons of Alphaeus. Therefore it's possible they were brothers, though they are never mentioned as brothers in the biographies, whereas Andrew and Simon are both called brothers, as are James and John. So why weren't Matthew and James described as brothers? Well, it could be that there was just a large age difference between them, or they'd gone very separate ways in life, so they weren't closely connected. If they were from the same family, it's easy to see that Matthew would not have been very popular at family gatherings. He was a tax collector for the Roman occupation force, and so he would have been seen almost as a traitor to his own people. Matthew would have been one of the very last people we could have imagined as part of the inner core of the Jesus movement. It would be like choosing a notorious drug dealer, a human trafficker, or city banker as part of a mission team today. Matthew 9 from verse 9. This is how Matthew was called. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. Quote, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." At the end of the 16th century, Caravaggio produced this remarkable painting of the calling of Matthew. And Matthew cannot believe that Jesus is calling him to leave his worldly life as the light from the high window falls onto Matthew while he's sitting in the gloomy room. What's so remarkable about Matthew is that he clearly was very well connected with the other tax collectors and sinners. When he realized that he could have a new life with Jesus, he was able to gather all his friends together for a dinner party with Jesus as the celebrity guest. It must have been a wonderful and glorious party, the living God surrounded with all those with the very worst reputations, the criminal and corrupt from society. It's no wonder that the more traditional religious people found the whole situation so outrageous. So we come to the last two of Jesus' specially chosen followers, Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot. These two did seem to have something in common. They were both probably from revolutionary groups opposing the Roman occupation of Palestine. Simon is described as a zealot, which probably meant he was associated with freedom fighters or even terrorists dedicated to getting rid of the Romans. Can you imagine how a zealous anti-Roman terrorist would have got on with Matthew, the tax collector who'd been assisting the Roman occupation? This collection of followers was certainly not a collection of two-dimensional sheep or clones. They were complicated and difficult characters from the extremes of society. Now, Judas Iscariot, son of Simon Iscariot. This is surely the darkest and most troubling of the disciples. That they were all capable of betraying Jesus is clear. When Jesus even predicted that one of them would betray him, each of them knew they could do it. The disciples did not immediately think of Judas Iscariot. Nevertheless, the flaws in his character could be seen more clearly with hindsight. John notes how Judas used to steal money out of the communal purse, and Judas was never pleased if money was wasted, because then he couldn't get it. What did make Judas Iscariot tick? What led him to make the decisions that he made? Why did he betray an innocent man to death? His name might provide a clue to the kind of man that he was. His name, or the name of his father, Simon Iscariot, might simply indicate that he was from the town of Kerioth, far to the south even of Jerusalem and Hebron. That in itself could show how he had a different outlook than the Galilean disciples. But when we consider how cosmopolitan the whole of Israel and Palestine was in this time, this in itself cannot really explain Judas's life and death. This strip of land was and is the meeting of Asia, Africa and Europe, the Occident and the Orient. It's always been filled with people from all over the world. And the fact that Judas may have grown up 30 miles south of Jerusalem, well, it'd be a bit parochial and simplistic to think that that was enough to explain him. That throughout this whole of the land, they would have been well used to people from all over the world, and that was normal. However, another theory says that the name Iscariot means of the Sicarii, and the Sicarii were an extremist group of zealots actively resisting the Roman occupation with violence. The word Sicarii simply means daggers, indicating the lengths to which they would go in their direct action. We can well see why Jesus might select zealots like Simon and Judas. Idealists and revolutionaries can be incredible people if the dreams and visions are tempered by love and reality. This Sicarii theory of Judas Iscariot has led some to speculate that Judas betrayed Jesus because Judas was expecting Jesus to lead the revolution against the Romans. When Judas saw the huge crowds welcome Jesus into Jerusalem, perhaps he saw an opportunity. Perhaps if Jesus was seized by the authorities, it would precipitate a more direct solution to the building tension in the land. Jesus would have to take control of the people, directing their power against the Romans. The people would never allow Jesus the Messiah to be killed by the Romans or compromised Jewish leaders. Judas could tip the situation into revolution by his betrayal. This idea has been quite popular for the last 50 years or so. It probably makes us more comfortable to understand Judas, to see him as misunderstood or as a tortured idealist, a hot-headed freedom fighter. Nevertheless, this is not the picture of Judas that the eyewitness accounts preserve for us. First, whereas it is just possible that Simon, Judas's father, may have been part of the Sicarii, there's nothing much to suggest that Judas himself was part of this group or was an idealistic freedom fighter. In addition, such a secret group of assassins would be highly unlikely to parade their membership of this highly illegal group in their common family name. Second, all the bits and pieces that we do see of Judas fit a much more simple story. He really does seem to be a man who loved money, and when the opportunity for money arose, he took it, even though it was something he knew to be wrong. Judas was not a complex or tortured soul, but a very normal, selfish human being like the rest of us. He allowed the love of money to grip him until he was ready to commit real evil for it. The water in the pan warmed up so slowly that the frog was boiled before it noticed it. And Judas gave himself over to money until the devil found an easy and open home in Judas' heart and mind.